Good morning. The scripture reading this morning is from Genesis chapter 30, verse 25 through chapter 31, verse 46, found on page 23 in your pew Bible. Ready, gentlemen? After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban,
"Send me on my way so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you."
But Laban said to him,
"If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages, and I will pay them."
Jacob said to him,
You know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. That a little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?
"What shall I give you?"
he asked.
Don't give me anything.
Jacob replied,
But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all of your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future whenever you check on the wages you have paid me. Any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen."
"Agreed.
said Laban.
Let it be as you have said."
That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats. All of them had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all of the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from that belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them,
"I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said, 'The speckled ones will be your wages,' then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, 'The streaked ones will be your wages,' then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. In breeding season I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in a dream, 'Jacob.' I answered, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land.'"
Then Rachel and Leah replied, "Do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you." Then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all the livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban in Aramean by not telling him he was running away. So he fled with all that he had, crossed the Euphrates River, and headed for the hill country of Gilead. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled, taking his relatives with him. He pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Then God came to Laban in Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him, and Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob,
What have you done? You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?"
Jacob answered Laban,
I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it.
Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the 2 female servants, but he found nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent, but nothing was found. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So he searched, but could not find the household gods. Jacob was angry and took Laban to task.
What is my crime? He asked Laban. How have I wronged you that you hunt me down? Now that you have searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? I put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the 2 of us. I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself. And you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you for 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flocks, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you.
Laban answered Jacob,
"The women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine, yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about the children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us."
So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives,
Gather some stones.
So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home.
Leaders. So, don't have to be too concerned. The length of the reading does not determine the length of the sermon. So, I'm not going to preach for an hour and 20 minutes. Just an hour. A few years ago, I heard an interesting report about something that happened in a city called Hamtramck, Michigan, just by Detroit. In the city of Hamtramck, the roads were riddled with potholes all over. and the city was broke, had no money to fix them, had no plan for fixing them. So one day a group of neighbors were sitting around commiserating about all the money they'd spent on tie rods and ball joints and flat tires and bent rims, and they were so sick and tired of the city not doing anything that they had this idea. The next day, one of the people in that group, named Jonathan Weir, took some extra money from his paycheck and he bought 17 bags of asphalt. And then that weekend, he and his friends borrowed some tools and a truck, and they went around their neighborhood fixing the potholes. This became a movement, and every Saturday, crews would go out of regular citizens fixing potholes for their own city, and they called themselves the Hamtramck Guerrilla Road Crew. They figured since the city couldn't do anything to help them, they had better help themselves. And I say that because there's a resemblance between that and the way we live our lives sometimes. We believe in God. We believe that He is there to help us and to bless us. But in practice, we often live as if He's not really going to do anything, so we better just help ourselves. We live as if He either has no power or no plan to do good things for us. The truth is that it's not up to us to get ourselves through our tough times or to solve our problems, to overcome our obstacles, because God is on our side. God is for us. He wants to help us, to bless us, to guide us, to direct us. He almost always does those things in ways that we don't expect, at times that we don't expect, but He is faithful to His promise to us, to bless us. God made a promise to Jacob. Remember back when Jacob was running away from his brother Esau, he had deceived his brother Esau, and he had to run away to his relative's house 500 miles away, and he stopped in a place called Bethel, and he had this dream where he meets God. In chapter 28:15, and God had said to him in this dream, "I am with you, and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." All that was just read, all of the sprawling, strange narrative that we just heard, is about God being faithful to His promise, to be with Jacob, to watch over him, and to bring him back to his land. Do you see that? And so I want to take you this morning on a quick tour of this passage with 3 stops. A tour that shows us how God is being faithful to His promise. The first stop is how He makes Jacob prosper. The second is how He guides Jacob. And the third is how He defends Jacob, how He protects him. But then my hope is that as we see how God was faithful to Jacob, all of us will see in a more real way in our own lives how God is faithful to us, how we can depend on Him to keep His promise to us. Well, the first stop is to see some sheep, where we see how for 14 years Laban has been taking advantage of Jacob, but all of that is about to change because God is on Jacob's side. After Joseph is born, Jacob is itching to get back home. A trip that was supposed to be just a couple weeks has turned into 14 years. 14 years of being under the thumb of his abusive, manipulative uncle Laban, where Jacob has kind of gotten a taste of his own medicine. But he's sick and tired of it. God has blessed Jacob, as we heard last time, with children, with many children, 13 children. But still, Jacob has no property, no wealth to his name because he's served for 14 years just for his 2 wives. And so Jacob makes his request to leave. His second 7 years are up. And Laban says, "Oh, I don't know. You're too valuable to me. God has blessed me through you." And Laban puts on the charm and says, "If I have found favor in your eyes, would you please stay?" But what he's really saying is, "I need you. You're not going anywhere. You're too valuable to me." And so Jacob makes a modest proposal. He says, "Okay, I'll stay and work for you. But here's the deal. Every sheep and goat in your flock that is born that is speckled or spotted, multicolored, I will keep those and you can have the rest." Now the multicolored sheep and goats were pretty rare. So Laban's thinking, well, how could I say no to that? And he says, "Okay, we got a deal. Jacob, you can keep all the multicolored animals and I'll keep the solid white and black ones. And we'll always know whose is whose." Laban is still playing dirty though, because to stack the odds more in his favor, he removes all of the multicolored animals from his flock and separates them and says, "Well, let's see how Jacob does this now, huh?" But Jacob has a trick up his sleeve too. See these guys going back and forth. You think, why would Jacob make such a bad deal for himself, right? Well, maybe he was counting on the fact that he could use these folk magical practices of putting up these strips of wood, and that when the ewe would see this when she was pregnant, it would somehow affect the color of the sheep inside, right? Through that and selective breeding, he makes his herd larger and stronger than his uncle's over 6 years. Now, Jacob might be thinking that his own wits and ingenuity have done this, right? He's figured this out. But the story actually shows us otherwise. Now, if I asked Katie Ballard, and I haven't yet, but Katie's in animal science, and if I said, "Katie, do you think there's any merit to this idea that when an animal sees something, it makes an impression on the embryo of the new animal?" I would guess you'd say no. Genetics doesn't work that way, right? The point of this story, though, is that it was God who did that. It wasn't Jacob's ingenuity and cleverness. Look at how it shows this. First, Jacob reports to his 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, that Laban had kept changing the terms of the agreement, and yet every time Laban changed the terms, the animal still went to him, to Jacob. This is in chapter 31, 7 now. He says, "God has not allowed him to harm me. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me." And then God himself gives Jacob this insight in a dream. He gives Jacob a dream where he looks out and sees the animals breeding and notices that the only ones that are breeding are the ones that are going to be for him. And God is actually overseeing how the animals are reproducing. And God says, "I have seen what Laban has been doing to you in this dream." In other words, God is saying, "I'm with you, Jacob. I notice what's going on. I'm on your side. I'm the one that's making this happen." Rachel and Leah, when they hear this, they agree. Verse 31:16, "Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children." God is behind this. You see, Laban thought that he could continue to use Jacob Jacob thought that he could outwit Laban, but God had a different idea. God's plan was to bless Jacob by redistributing the wealth from Laban to Jacob, that Laban had essentially stolen from him over all these years by not paying him anything. God is on Jacob's side. He promised to be with him. He promised to bless him. He promised to watch over him, and that's what he's doing in this section. God has made Jacob prosper. Well, the second stop is to see how God guides Jacob. He guides him back to the land of his fathers. He's been with Jacob, he's watched over him, and now he's saying it's time to go. It's time to go home. And this becomes clear to Jacob in actually three different ways in chapter 31. First, Jacob notices his circumstances. He says, it says Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. A way of saying Laban is starting to get pretty ticked at Jacob that his wealth is increasing while Laban's wealth decreases. And Jacob feels like this might be an opportune time to get out of town. But secondly, God speaks to Jacob directly. Chapter 31, verse 3. The Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." Right? And then, this is confirmed by other people, by his wives. Jacob reports to them, and they say, "Do what God has told you." See, Jacob is hearing this loud and clear. God is giving him guidance through his circumstances, through other people, and through God's own voice saying, it's time to go. It's time to go home. And so, what does Jacob do? He gets out of Dodge. He listens to God's call. And one day when Laban is out in the countryside shearing the sheep, Jacob packs everything up, his animals, his tents, his valuables, his wives and children, loads it all up on camels and starts heading west, back toward home. God has called him and he is responding to that call. So God guides Jacob. The third stop is to see how God then defends Jacob and protects him from Laban's attack and Laban's accusation. When Laban hears that Jacob has escaped, he's furious, right? He feels like he's been duped. And Jacob and his family have a 3-day head start. But Laban gathers up some of his family and pursues them for 7 days and catches up with them in the hill country of Gilead, just outside of Canaan. Now, the night before he catches up to Jacob, he has a dream, right, in which God says, basically, don't mess with Jacob anymore. But he catches up to them, and in this last scene, the two men have a final showdown. This is now chapter 31, verses 25 and following. Laban rips into Jacob with every accusation and threat he can think of. He's like, "Why did you deceive me? I wanted to throw you a party before you go. I wanted to kiss my daughters. By the way, don't you know I could hurt you if I wanted to? God told me not to harm you, but don't you know I could?" He's just grasping for anything he can. And Laban is not just making empty threats. You all know difficult people like Laban, right? People who have to get their way. And what happens when someone like that is crossed? They get dangerous, right? They might manipulate more. They might do something worse and get violent. That's why Jacob said, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. That's why I didn't say goodbye. But Laban has another grievance too. He thinks that Jacob has stolen his precious household gods. What are these things? These are little figurines that had an image of a deity that the family would worship and trust in, or maybe their ancestors that they would honor. And these were extremely valuable family heirloom possessions. They'd be Laban's most important possession, passed down from generation to generation. He thought that these figurines were giving his family blessing and protection and safety. And so he says, Jacob, why did you steal my gods? And Jacob says, what are you talking about? I didn't take your gods. If anyone has them, they can be put to death. Of course, the reader, we know, well, actually, Rachel does have them. She stole them on the way out of town. I guess that they mean something to her still, too. And we hold our breath as Laban goes through Jacob's camp and tears it apart looking for these things until he comes up to Rachel sitting on her camel. And there those figurines are stuffed in her saddlebag underneath her. And when Laban comes up to her camel, she thinks fast and says, I can't get up because I'm having my period. I'm sorry, Dad. And so Laban says, all right. And Laban, at this point, has got nothing left to say. Now Jacob, when Laban is now silenced, Jacob's 20 years of frustration and anger come spilling out, come gushing out. And he says he takes Laban to task. He says, what wrong have I ever done to you? I've worked for you for 20 years like a slave. I worked myself to the bone, and you didn't give me anything. You changed my wages 10 times. And here's the main point. Verse 42, underline it, highlight it. He says, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, had not been with me, you would have surely sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night He rebuked you. God defends Jacob. God makes sure that Laban isn't going to mess with him anymore. That Jacob can continue on and doing what God has called him to do. By now, Jacob knows it, Laban knows it, Jacob's wives know it. We all know that God is on Jacob's side. He's for him. He is blessing him and guiding him and defending him. He's keeping his promise to be with him, to watch over him, just like he had made in chapter 28, verse 15. So, you say, well, that's great for Jacob. Do you actually believe that God is for you? That He has promised to guide you and bless you and watch over you? I hope that you've been thinking that through this story. Well, what about for me? Does God actually treat me the same way? In my life, in my health problem, or in my parenting issue, or in my family crisis, or in stuff at work that feels impossible, does God actually want to bless me and guide me? Because it doesn't feel like it sometimes. Is God really for me? Is He really for me or not? I mean, we all wonder that. We all have to ask that question. And if you're like me, sometimes you live as if God is not. Sometimes you live as if it's up to you to solve your problems, to figure things out, to overcome your obstacles. It's you against the world, you against your enemies, you against your problems. The story of Jacob was written to teach the people of Israel that their God could be trusted. That because just as God had been faithful to Jacob, their ancestor, he would be faithful to them. Like when they were slaves in Egypt, they could trust him to bring them out. When they were captives in exile, they could trust him to bring them back home. They could trust God because their God was the God of Jacob. They followed the same God. Psalm 146:5 says, "Blessed are those whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the name of the Lord." If your God is the God of Jacob, you're blessed. He's your help. He's your hope. Many people trust in things that are not the God of Jacob. They trust in essentially idols, things that they think will give their life success or significance or blessing. And we all, to some extent, have those things, those idols in our lives. But just like Laban's gods, Laban's idols were powerless to help him. He thought they were the key to his success and his blessing, but they weren't. They couldn't do anything. They were stuffed into a saddlebag underneath Rachel. But Jacob, look at who his God was. His God blessed him. His God guided him. His God protected him. And his God is the same God that we worship now. It's the same God who sent Jesus to live and to die and to rise again for us, so that we could have a relationship with God. Now for us to hope in the Lord and for God to be our help is to depend on what Jesus has done. To see the cross and to realize that Jesus has given everything for you, to show you how much he is for you, how much God is for you. Paul says in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? What more could we want than that, right? God gave us Jesus to show how radically committed he is to our good, to show how much he is for us, how much he wants what's best for us, how much he is going to bless us and guide us and defend us. He will bless you and make your life prosper. Not necessarily by giving you a lot of sheep, like Jacob, in more important ways, making your soul prosper, providing you everything you need for life. He will guide you. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Are you listening to his guidance, his voice? He will defend you against all evil and everything that wants to harm you, of which there are many of those things in this world. God is your defender, your protector. You can know all that because of Jesus, because God, the God of Jacob, has given you his Son to show you how much he is for you. So, I want to leave you with a question. How would you live differently tomorrow if you believed 100% that God is for you? How would you live differently if you believed with all your heart that God was on your side, that God wanted to bless you and guide you and protect you? maybe whatever difficulty you're going through now, and I know that you all are, maybe that would seem a little easier, a little lighter, because you know that whatever happens, God is going to use it for good and going to bless you, and going to help you. Life can be hard. I mean, look at Jacob. God was with Jacob. Jacob still had a hard life. And I bet for a lot of those 20 years, he didn't feel like God was on his side, but God was. God fulfilled his purpose, fulfilled his promise to Jacob. So maybe whatever difficulty you're going through would just feel lighter, and you'd feel more peace and comfort and joy. Or maybe you would live less independently of God. Maybe right now you're like the guerrilla road crew going around your life, filling in all your own potholes, trying to fix everything yourself. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be proactive, but maybe the more you know that God is for you, the more you'll depend on Him and pray, ask Him for help, wait and see how He shows up. It isn't you against the world, you against your problems, you against your enemies. It's you and God against all of that. Which is like saying, you've got LeBron James on your team in 5th grade basketball, right? 5th and 6th. God is for you. He's on your side. Nothing can happen to you that is not for your good when you trust in the Lord. Blessed are you whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the name of the Lord. Amen? Lord, we pray now for the strength to believe that you are for us. Despite whatever's happening in our lives today,